I'm Karen Taylor. I am Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening. This includes both our in-person audience and our online audience. Tonight we have what is going to be a fascinating program, Making It in America, the almost impossible quest to manufacture in the USA and how it got that way. And this is a conversation with Rachel Slade, author of Making It in America, and photographer Chris Payne, author of Made in America. And I want to mention that both these wonderful books, Making It in America, and indeed Made in America, are both going to be for sale this evening. For our in-person audience, you'll be able to purchase these from Amy at the end of the talk. And for our online audience, you will be able to find it at the website that you shall see on the screen at this very moment. A reminder, please, to our in-person audience to switch off your phones. And we also request, never mind what we're also going to request, just forget that. For those of you less familiar with the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our 239-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our various educational and cultural programs. These include the General Society Library, of course, of which for our in-person audience we are sitting in this evening. We have a tuition-free Mechanics Institute, where our students for this year will be graduating from on Thursday. We have the John M. Mossman Lock Museum, which you're all very welcome to visit after, well, the in-person audience anyway, after the talk tonight. And finally, we have our lecture series, our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, which of course tonight's talk is part of. Tonight, Rachel Slade and Chris Payne will present their unique perspectives and reflect on what made in the USA really means to Americans in the 21st century. And as many of you know, we had the good fortune to have Chris speak here in February, and tonight, in a way, is a continuation of that conversation. Rachel Slade is the acclaimed author of Into the Raging Sea, a national bestseller, New York Times notable book, and winner of the Maine Literary Award for Nonfiction. She spent a decade in the City magazine trenches at Boston, first as a design editor, ultimately as executive editor. Her editing and writing have won national awards in civic journalism, reporting, criticism, and reader service. She recently taught a political science course with Dr. Etan Hirsch at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, and was recently one of the recipients of the prestigious McDowell Fellowship. Chris Payne specializes in architectural and industrial photography. Trained as an architect, and by the way, Rachel was also trained as an architect, so there's an interesting fact. He is fascinated by design, assembly, and the built form. He is the author of New York's Forgotten Substations, The Power Behind the Subway, Asylum, Inside the Closed World of State Mental Hospitals, North Brother Island, The Last Unknown Place in New York City, which, by the way, he did speak on a number of years ago, and finally, Making Steinway, An American Workplace. His work has been featured in publications around the world with frequent special presentations in the New York Times Magazine. It is now my great pleasure to introduce you to Rachel Slade, who will start tonight's talk and the conversation with Chris. A very warm welcome, Rachel.
Sure. Hello and welcome. It is an honor to be here tonight. Funny story. You're probably wondering, why are two architects writing about making it in America? That's actually the question that I had when I got an email from this guy who I never met back in January when my book came out. So, quick, brief story. My first book talk for this book, Making It in America, was at the Harvard bookstore. And of course, I got there early because I'm compulsive. And I was wandering the bookshop, and I found this big, heavy, expensive, beautiful book. And it was called Made in America, and it had all these lovely photographs in it. And I thumbed through it, and I said, this is so expensive, so big, so heavy. I'm going to buy it. And I actually, before I even spoke at that event, I presented the book and I said, look, we still make things here. And here's a whole book of photography dedicated to it. As a twist of fate, Chris Payne actually wrote to me a couple days later through email. And he said, we went to the same schools and we're looking at the same thing. So I graduated from Barnard in 91. Chris graduated from Columbia in 90. Is that right? We never met. Then Chris went to University of Pennsylvania to get his master's in architecture, and so did I. We never met, until now. So this is our first opportunity to speak together. So thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy this very much. I think this is going to be a fairly rich presentation because we're coming at this question from different places. But a little bit about my background. This is Chris's book. Okay. I am from deindustrialized America. This is my hometown in 1920. Anybody know where this is? Yes, thank you. Did you cheat? This is Philadelphia. What you see no longer exists, but this was the Baldwin Locomotive Factory. Massive, massive. It is no longer there. They actually moved further out to Chester before vanishing altogether when trucks took over. But the reality of my world has always been living in deindustrialized places. And in fact, when I started going to Barnard, I would take the New Jersey Transit, the slow train, back and forth from Philadelphia to New York whenever we had a break. And I would go miles and miles and miles through North Philadelphia, where so much industrialization had taken place and vanished. And so this was very, very haunting to me, because I saw the factories. They were, of course, all still there. This would have been obviously in the late 80s, early 90s. All of the factories were still there. Lots of the housing was still there. And yet it was a total wasteland. It was somewhat equivalent to Dresden after the war. And so my consciousness was shaped by these post-industrial spaces and kind of the cataclysmic effect of what happens when industry leaves a place. So this was me. This was me thinking about these things and being haunted by these images of, massive factories, empty, boarded up, housing, where people no longer want to live. People sometimes stuck in places where there are no jobs. And so throughout my adult life, one of my big questions was, how did we get here? How could we do this to ourselves? And is this important? Is this something that we should think about? Is this something that we should care about? So with my first book, Into the Raging Sea, I was talking about shipping. It's about a container ship, an American container ship that actually sunk in 2015. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but it was the biggest maritime disaster, American maritime disaster in a couple of generations. 33 people died on that ship, Americans. And through researching shipping, I learned so much more about how dependent we are on imports. And, when I first started talking about that book back in 2018 when it came out, I would kind of slip in these words that at the time, a general audience wouldn't really have a good handle on, like supply chains and imports, and the fact that 90% of everything that we touch and everything that we wear has spent some time on a container ship. I was trying to really stress the importance of shipping in the modern world, right? And I would get kind of blank stares. And then 2020 happened. And suddenly everybody's talking about supply chains. And everybody's talking about how dependent we are on imports. That's when I knew that maybe, possibly, I had an opportunity to write about this rather wonky topic and get a broad readership maybe more interested in this question about us, about Americans, about who we are, who we were, and what we want to be going forward. Is this something that we want to support? Is this something that we want to tariff? Is this something that we want to, throw into schools, educate people, get people interested in manufacturing? Do we care? Is this something important to us as a nation? And so those were the questions that I was asking when I started researching this book. All right, so I just wanted to very briefly go back in time to right around the time, a little bit before this society was formed. The 13 colonies, I'm a 13 colony gal. I was born in Baltimore, raised in Philadelphia, went to school in New York, and now I live in Boston. I'm very much a 13 colony person. So the 13 colonies were basically a big shopping mall for British imported goods. And so this graphic is just showing you all the manufactured goods came from England or on English ships. They were heavily taxed. And that's how England made a living, right? Colonizing other places, creating shopping malls for their goods, taxing them, upcharging, and it was extremely frustrating for the colonists at some point because what they really wanted to do was obviously to be independent of taxation by a country that they had very little control over, the politics. So before the American Revolution, this is where we were. Manufactured goods coming in, raw goods going out. It actually looks quite a bit like today, except that the goods are crossing a different ocean. After the American Revolution, we won, by the way. After the American Revolution, one of the first things that George Washington did when he took over the presidency was turn to a young, handsome Alexander Hamilton, and he said, we need to figure out how to get manufacturing going in America, because we didn't make anything, and we desperately needed to. All of the founding fathers understood that if you made your own goods, then you were no longer dependent on other nations to determine your politics, your economy, and your culture. And so this was a critical part of starting a new country, starting our nation, was jump-starting manufacturing. And so Alexander Hamilton spent a year talking to people, very smart people, financiers, people who were interested in getting into manufacturing, people who had made a lot of money in trade. And he delivered the Report of Manufacturers to Congress in 1791. And his three principles, I think, still apply today. So the three principles to transform America from an import-dominated economy to a manufacturing economy, here they are. Tariff the goods, tariff the hell out of imports to create a demand for domestic goods. The imports are too expensive. We need to make them ourselves. That's the plan. The second is to establish a stable currency. Can you imagine in those days what it must have been like with nobody trusting anything? Do you know that the soldiers after the war, the American soldiers after the war were given like script, the equivalent to script that was actually worthless because we didn't have a stable currency. So the idea was to establish a national bank to finance industry, and then here's the third part, tax and tariff, obviously these imports, and then use that revenue to support both the national bank, so the national bank can start financing domestic industry, and build infrastructure. Build infrastructure that's interior. So instead of just port-centric infrastructure, which is what we used to have, start to build interstate commerce, which of course proceeds to this day. So 1791, 2024, I believe these principles still hold. And very quickly, we start to enter the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's important to remember that, so at the top you'll see that's a water-powered spinning mill built by Sam Slater. It's in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, very close to where I live. That is actually the first factory in the US. And in 1813, we get the Boston Manufacturing Company, which was actually a conglomerate of men who had actually enriched themselves through shipping. Focusing now on getting into the Industrial Revolution. This is the first integrated factory in America. They not only spin, but they also weave to create textiles, cotton textiles. Of course, the cotton is coming from the South. By the way, if you are unfamiliar, we did not know how to build these things. We did not have the technology or the know-how. We didn't understand how to create mills. That knowledge was not here. It was actually a heavily guarded secret in England. And Francis Cabot Lowell, one of my fellow Bostonians, went to England under the guise of being an American yokel and talked his way into the factories there so that he could see how the mills were run. And he tried to remember everything because he actually got frisked on the way out of the country a couple of years later to make sure he wasn't holding any plans. And he tried to memorize everything. When he got back to the US, he quickly drew everything up. And then we actually needed immigrants from England to supplement what he remembered to get these factories actually up and running. So it took quite a bit of work for Americans to join the Industrial Revolution and a bit of corporate espionage. Does that make us look better or worse? I don't know, you decide. But in any case, when manufacturing first began up in New England, it was imagined as a utopian effort. Lowell had seen the conditions in England, and they were pretty dire. Pretty soon you're going to get Dickens writing about the conditions in factories and around London. And they wanted to avoid that. America was mostly an agrarian country at that moment. And so the people who were working in these mills were farm girls, New England farm girls. And the farm girls, and men, of course, too, but the idea was you worked on your family's farm, and working in a factory was a fun coming-of-age thing that girls could do between the ages of like 18 and 20, and you earned actual money, hard currency. And the dorms were set up so that the girls could actually learn. They had speaker series just like this. They had lectures and libraries and all kinds of things. It was almost, believe it or not, for a very brief period of time, stick with me, a finishing school. That changed very quickly because more people started coming over. So the first wave of immigrants were Irish up where I am, Germans in Pennsylvania. That starts in the 1830s. And suddenly the people working in the factories look, act, and sound, and eat, and drink things that are very different from the factory owners. And the factory owners, by the way, although they are incredibly wealthy, are starting to turn their attention elsewhere. So the factories work, they're working. The labor is cheap because you have a lot of immigrants coming in. And there's now westward expansion starting to happen. And so a lot of capital is going in that direction. It's important for me to remind you that the labor movement starts now. That from the very beginning of industrialization in the United States, people were trying to organize. They were trying to organize so that they would have better working conditions, right? Stable pay on time. They weren't cheated. That they weren't actually, with the women, especially in these mills, weren't exploited sexually for the opportunity to work in these mills. These are things that actually happen all around the world right now in textile and apparel industry. It started here. So the women, the girls got together. I love this piece. This is the Constitution of the Lowell Factory Girls Association. I mean, already they're starting to understand that collectively they have power. And so the story of American manufacturing is also the story of capitalism tempered by the labor movement. And that's an important part of my book. I was really looking for a way into the labor movement, to talk about the labor movement, which is why I selected the factory up in Maine that I focused my narrative on. But it becomes a theme throughout my book and obviously throughout history. All right, so I'm going to, I think, come, my friend Chris, here you go.
Hi. So my interest in these mills, we kind of meet together, but she said we came from different directions. It's fun to speak about this tonight because usually I speak about the Made in America stuff and all these other factories, but it all started with textile mills. And I'm from Boston, and when I grew up, all my clothes, my Timberlands, my moccasins, the penny loafers, they're all made in New England, even if I wasn't really aware of it. But, over time, I saw these towns that were just gutted out, and I didn't really know anything about it then. But later on, when I became a photographer, that kind of information accumulates and manifests itself in sometimes, interesting ways that lead to books. And so I wrote a book called Asylum. And in that, I went all over the country to these state hospitals, and all the state hospitals had these manufacturing components that made them self-sufficient. And I thought that was really amazing, that this notion of making your own things and shoes and clothing was integral, even if it was a way to fund the hospitals and keep them going. But the way self-sufficiency is a way to, create good mental health and physical well-being. And so that stayed with me. And then after the book was done, I was wondering what am I going to do next? And I stumbled on this old yarn mill in Maine, and that's coming next. And I should probably just brief you with this. This is a Lewis Hine image. And for anyone who's interested in industrial photography, these are kind of like the mecca of where it all began. And Lewis Hine was a photographer who lived from like 1870 to 1940, and he was the one basically responsible for ending child labor in factories. But aside from the social impact that these images had, when I was coming up as an industrial photographer, doing Asylum and substations and all that, I knew about images like this, and they stuck with me. And I said, man, if I could find something like that, wouldn't that be amazing? Does it still exist? Does this kind of like Lowell utopian society that I didn't really even know about, does that still exist? And it was all around me in New England, but it was all kind of abandoned until I stumbled on this yarn mill in Maine that reminded me. How do I go back? Oh, the little one. Yeah. Sorry about that. Now I'm really too far back. Okay, there we go. I stumbled on this yarn mill in Maine that reminded me of the state hospital workshops. It was like a working museum, whereas those places has long been abandoned. This mill was still intact making yarn. It was like walking back in time. And I befriended the mill owners, and through these casual conversations, they said, well, if you like this, you should check out this other mill. They still, it's still going. And then I talked to a worker, and before long, they're saying, I had this whole kind of network of places to go. And I befriended the mill owners who on more than one occasion would remind me, would say, Chris, you really should come up today. We're running pink. Now, this is a story for New Yorkers. I've told it before. I say it in all my lectures, but imagine this. I'm living in Brooklyn. I get the call. The guy says, you got to come up. It's a three and a half hour drive. I already have this picture. I'd already made it. He said, we're running pink. It's pretty awesome. The problem was I had a parking spot right outside my apartment. Obviously, I went up and I made this picture. But, the point is that I was uncovering this past that I didn't know existed. And what I realized after talking to all of these mill workers, you'd speak to them and say, well, my father worked here, my brother worked here, my grandmother worked here, and you could trace this line. You're having a conversation with them, and you're looking at them in their eyes, and you're going all the way back to the 19th century. There's this direct line. And I realized that, this project was more than just this sort of visual exercise in extracting beauty in these old buildings. It was really an archaeological, anthropological exercise, trying to get back to something that I just, wanted to touch, because it seemed like, as we see here, this utopian ideal, or, these purpose-built factories that made something, and things that, just don't exist anymore. I wanted to show one image. We're going to try to stay away from the abandoned stuff, but I had to show this because I'm speaking about the textiles today and not all the other stuff. And so this kind of frees me up to talk about images that I would never show. And this was in a silk mill in Maryland that imported silk from Japan. And the women would work in the factory and the men would work in the coal mines. It was way in Western Maryland, basically West Virginia. And they walked off the site in 1957 on a Friday. They ended that day of work thinking they would come back on Monday. They never did. And so when I went there in 2012, it was as if time had stood still. And so I kind of felt like I'd found that Louis Hine image. I mean, it was amazing. There's no telling what it looks like now, but anyway, it was incredible. So I was on my way. And now we will get back to you and we'll circle back at the end. Thank you.
That's yours too.
Oh, well, we can both talk about this. But one of the things that, when we had so much fun talking about this, because like each of us kind of lives in this little vacuum where we're interested in these, particular industries and places in time. And who are you going to talk to about this stuff that's as interested? So we're just, we went down deep and we had so much fun preparing this lecture. And it was also, as I said, when I read her book, it makes me very sad, because when I was at these mills, all of the equipment was made in New England, in Massachusetts, primarily. And, when we talk about manufacturing, it's not just like making a sweatshirt. It's making all the other stuff that makes that possible. It's all the little industries that feed into the making of that one object. And when you take away the apparel industry or something else, the main factory, everything else dies. And so it would just kill me to be going through these mills, whether or not they were abandoned, whether or not they were in use, and see these old machines. And the only way they could keep them going was by cannibalizing older equipment or by making something special order. None of it exists. And what's also sad is that, you realize it's not just the machines that made this stuff, but it's all the other kinds of things that would go into a sweatshirt or a shirt or a pair of pants or a suit. It's all the thread. And like all of these companies each had their own history and were unique in some way and making something special. And none of it exists anymore in this country. We literally, as the pandemic showed us, we literally can't, we couldn't clothe ourselves if all those cargo ships stopped running. Anyway, I'll be back.
This is true. Yeah. Okay. We're going to kill ourselves on this eventually. Thank you, Chris. So just picking up, because we're in New York, I think it's important also to just talk about what an important role that New York City played in workplace reform. The wealthy women of New York around the turn of the last century got very interested in the industry that was happening all around them. And at the same time, they were getting politicized and demanding the right to vote. And so for that 20 years between 1900 and 1920, when women finally got a right to vote, one of their big focuses was on the other women on the other side of the city who were making their clothes and other things that they needed. And of course, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was a galvanizing moment. That was in 1911. But it's important to understand that like a lot of wealthy women, society women, were already very tuned into the working conditions that other women were facing, immigrant women were facing in these industries on which we depended. And again, because we're in New York, I just wanted to highlight Frances Perkins. Sometimes we forget about her, but she was here in New York. She actually witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which then allowed her to get politically active. She focused here when Franklin Roosevelt was governor on workplace safety in New York. She actually capped the number of hours one could work in New York City. This is all before 1920. And then she became Secretary of Labor under FDR, and she was the architect of Social Security, minimum wage, unemployment insurance, regulating child labor. And she also worked in immigration and naturalization law. So New York making suddenly catalyzes this whole concern and movement around workers' rights, and workers' safety, which of course then spirals out into all of our lives. What we consider a work week now, what we consider acceptable working conditions. Okay, so America is on its way, by hook or by crook. It's making things. We're here in this Carnegie-built environment. I loved seeing this massive steel girder here. Obviously, that must have come out of US Steel. I love seeing the rivets and everything. This was American might, but there were many sacrifices along the way. We talked briefly about the workers, but there were also other sacrifices, the environment and that sort of thing. So it was an interesting moment. Right after World War II, as you can see from this chart, we suddenly decide that we want to be part of the global economy in a new way. And so we lower those tariffs dramatically. You can see the precipitous drop from about 1932 all the way down to 1950, very precipitous drop in tariffs of imports. And then look where we are now, very, very low. Unprecedented, 1980, it begins. When you remove tariffs, of course, you remove barriers to entry into the American market, and that's what we've been talking about very recently in the newspapers. In fact, today, just today, a friend of mine from the American Alliance of Manufacturing, which is actually supported by US steelworkers, United Steelworkers, was in the White House because Biden just signed into law higher tariffs. His administration has spent a lot of time considering this, but higher tariffs on things that we should be making ourselves, like solar panels, like cars, like chips. So what he's trying to do through these tariffs is, of course, stimulate domestic manufacturing by leveling the playing field so that these things cannot not be made or imported here artificially cheaper than they cost to produce, which is what's happening at the moment globally, mostly from China. And this is a really big thing for America. So you have the labor movement. The labor movement is starting to be recognized. Franklin Roosevelt gives people basically the legal right to organize. He creates the National Labor Relations Board so that people can come forward and petition legally for the right to collective bargaining. At the same time, or just a little bit after that, you start to get the civil rights movement. And I want to remind everybody that in 1963, the March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. gave that I Have a Dream speech, that march would not have happened without the support, the tremendous support of the United Auto Workers and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. This was a union endorsement of the civil rights movement. And when civil rights and labor started to row in the same direction, started to see how they could work together, that became extremely frightening for people in power and people who held most of the money. And you can imagine that there was a threat to a flip in power, that people would have more power, that there would be a power imbalance. And capitalism is always, of course, very concerned about how much power capitalism holds. So this was a very frightening moment. And this is exactly the moment when we have people like Milton Friedman starting to talk about the role of capitalism in the world. What is the purpose of capitalism? Milton Friedman made it very clear. The purpose of capitalism is to make money. There's no obligation to your workers. There's no obligation to where the factory is. There's no obligation to anybody else. You make profit, and your only constituents are your shareholders, and not stakeholders. Stakeholders are me. if I'm working in a factory. I'm a stakeholder, but it's shareholders. They are the only people who matter. And so Milton Friedman puts this forward, other people are following suit. It seems to align very well with this concern that there's this flip in the narrative, that there might be a flip in America where workers have a larger share of power. And you also have the emergence of people like Ronald Reagan. The American conservative movement really finds birth here. It's quite a moment, and as I see it, very tied to manufacturing, this moment where, should we really be making things in the United States anymore? I put Bonfire Vanities up because I love the book. It's really great. If you haven't read it in a while, read it. But that is the 80s. And the 80s are known, of course, for that moment when we really start to embrace the idea of free trade, right? We start to embrace the idea of profit over people. That's Ronald Reagan down on Wall Street, ringing the bell, I guess, very excited. And so that's the moment when, I'm sure you heard this before, but the great decoupling of people's wages in America from productivity. And that also is the moment when everybody, Republicans and Democrats alike, start to talk about free trade, like really start to talk about free trade, really start to interrogate, why are we making things here when we can make things cheaper abroad? And I just want to point out, just very quick, some numbers here. So we were sold the idea of free trade, which started, of course, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was negotiated under Bush 1, signed into law under Clinton. And I'm saying that because I want to stress that this is a bipartisan movement to lower barriers of entry into the market, right? To allow Mexicans to make our stuff. That was the whole idea, because it's cheaper, right? And I just want to show that the most important thing here is real GDP growth. There's a way to, oh, here it is. Real GDP growth. This is to 2016. Plummeted in America. Look at that. And I also want to point out this figure here. GDP growth per capita. So once we lowered trade barriers and manufacturing barriers through free trade agreements, look what happens to the United States. The growth per capita really plummets. And the reason for that is because manufacturing is expensive. American workers were expensive, but they were making good products, and they were making enough money to buy their products. When you offshore, then you try to transition people into the service industry, where people make much less and are much more disposable. Because manufacturing actually is a high skill employment opportunity, and there's incredible opportunity for growth, whereas the service industry actually has lower barriers of entry. And although a lot of people now are going to college more than ever, in fact, it's the manufacturing jobs that pay more, typically, because they're so valuable, because you need high skills to be able to do this kind of work. And then very quickly, share of income earned by top 1%. We've heard about income inequality. Here it is in one chart, showing you what happened in the US, which is blue, versus all of the other highly industrialized countries. That's offshoring, as far as I'm concerned. That is the story of manufacturing going abroad. It allows for large corporations to merge and then offshore the most expensive part of their operation to factories abroad. Then with those massive profits, they can reward themselves. Whoops, that's back, forward. Okay. Chris, tell your story.
So picking up where you left off, and picking up in my project, which was evolving organically. On one hand, I'm a photographer, and I'm always looking for beautiful imagery. That's what motivates me. And also, and particularly, trying to capture that kind of Lewis Hine imagery that you saw, not with the child, but with this sort of beautiful machinery that every industrial photographer loves. And one day, early on, I was on the phone with this guy in Fall River, and he made shirts. He had a shirt factory. And, you know, apparel factories, they can be anywhere. All you need is a sewing machine and a building, a rentable space. It's not sort of, it's not as purposeful as, let's say, a spinning mill. But he said to me, he said, you need to come up here and you need to see my factory. And then I'm going to show you a space. I'm going to show you there's one room I have here. And in that room, you will see the entire arc of the textile industry. You'll get it all in one shot. And I'm thinking this is going to be it. This is going to be the Lewis Hine picture that has eluded me, you know, for so long. Something not quite as abandoned as the one in Maryland, like something that they just kind of like walked away from last year. Or anyway, I didn't know what to expect. So I raced up there, walked down this big granite, you know, building, opens this door, it's empty. And I'm looking, what's going on? And he looked at me, this is all he said, gone to China. And I'm glad I made that picture that day because I wanted to just sort of like, I was so, you know, it's as a, you know, a young professional, I don't feel a kind of burden that he feels, you know, and these guys were very frank with me. They told me the same story about how hard it was to persevere in an economy that has turned its back on traditional manufacturing. You know, the cards always seem to be stacked against them. But I'm glad I made this picture because it seems to resonate now more than ever. And let's see what the next one is. So then the next one, well, this is sort of sets the stage for what your people, you know, were encountering. Is it like wherever you go, it's like there's just nothing left. But we're trying to paint a more positive picture tonight, so bear with us.
All right, so we've set the stage, and we've talked a lot, so we're going to try to breeze through this. This is basically where my narrative starts. So Maine. We have two couples here in this image. The couple on the left are Dan and Dory Waxman. They came up to Maine in the 70s. They were just hippies, and they were kind of back to the land, wanted to just figure out life on the rough coast of Maine. And they started having children, and Dan had to work, find actual work. And Dory, meanwhile, decided to start her own little factory, and hoping that maybe if they could make things and have their children help, this sounds like Lewis Hines, and have their children help, then she could have Dan home more because he was traveling a lot for work. And so they started this Old Port Wool and Textile Company. She was going from textile mill to textile mills in the early 90s before NAFTA was passed, in Maine, in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, and buying these beautiful woolen fabrics, and then finishing them in her home. Using neighborhood women, she taught them how to use the machines, and they would finish them, and then they would sell them. She sold them. And they actually ended up, in 1 year, a banner year, they did $500,000 worth of revenue. It was a very viable business. Then with the passage of NAFTA, very shortly thereafter, you start to see what Chris just showed you. And Dory actually has her own story of walking into a mill that she had gone into, you know, hundreds of times before to collect some beautiful fabric. All the looms had gone to China the weekend before. All right, so her son is the gentleman in the photo on the right. That's Ben. Ben is the protagonist of my story. So Ben comes from Maine, and he has been following his mother's trajectory. I mean, he's been going with her to these factories, and he's seen them closing, and he's seen her struggle after NAFTA, and he gets very politicized. And he ends up getting involved with the labor movement. He joins the AFL-CIO in 2003. The AFL-CIO is an umbrella organization that represents 12 million workers in all different trades. And then he ends up seeing the impact of offshoring all over the country. So remember, China joined the World Trade Organization in 2002, which meant that we lowered trade barriers to basically everybody in the world, including China. And China quickly, thanks to us, because we were offshoring, we were literally offshoring our equipment and our knowledge, and in some cases, every single part of production to China and other places because it could be done much more cheaply there, suddenly there was no reason to make things in America at all anymore. And so Ben was going around with the AFL-CIO trying to save workers' jobs at a time when they could not be saved. 2003 to 2013, shutting factories down, factory after factory, not because they were not profitable, but because they weren't profitable enough. Then Ben meets Whitney. He comes back, he's a broken man, he's devastated by what he's seen, he can't stop what's happening to workers and jobs and manufacturing, and he comes back up to Maine, and he meets Whitney, and he starts working on a plan to prove that capitalism can be a force of good, and that capitalism and labor can work together to create good jobs and rebuild community, and maybe even rebuild an industry. And so this is his dream. He doesn't know what he's gonna do. Whitney doesn't know what they're gonna do together as a couple, but they're gonna start something out of nothing. There was nothing in Maine, there was nothing in Portland. They start a factory. The factory is called American Roots. The idea was that they would make all American-sourced clothing with all union workers in America. This is a lot harder than it sounds. Okay, so the first thing that they decided to do, since they wanted to make clothing out of made in USA fabric, was go to polar fleece. Polar fleece was made in Massachusetts at the time. Polar fleece was actually designed by a third-generation factory owner, and as a collaboration between him, his name was Aaron Feuerstein, and Yvon Chouinard. I apologize if I'm skewering his name, the pronunciation of his name, but he's the founder of Patagonia. He came from Maine. Yvon came from Maine. So he had this whole manufacturing background in his blood. He was Quebecois, came to Maine, had a factory, had manufacturing, in the ecosystem, went out to California, started Patagonia, and then had this vision of a fleece fabric made out of polyester that would be light and yet warm when wet, unlike wool, which actually is not very useful when wet. And so he went to Malden Mills, and this is what's so important. This is part of my soapbox, if you will, is that innovation can only happen when you're making things. It's one thing to have an idea, it's another thing to be able to execute. And so this is actually a perfect example of this in the textile industry, of somebody who has an idea, went to a maker, said, let's try this, let's figure this out, and produced a fabric. Polar fleece. Fleece. It's everywhere now. Now we know it's problematic environmentally. Lo and behold, Chris actually photographed Malden Mills making polar fleece back in, what year was this?
2014, maybe?
Okay, 2014. Guys, a year later, they offshored. It was bought by private equity, offshored, no longer made in the United States. So Ben and Whitney suddenly didn't have a fabric. They had to turn to something that was homegrown. What's homegrown? America is the second largest producer of cotton in the world. We are in competition with India, but China is the first, India is the second, United States is the third. Cotton is grown all over the place in Mississippi, Texas, all over the South and West, Southwest. So this is what they created, an all-American sourced sweatshirt. Here you go. And this, if you buy this book, and it's my book, and I really hope you do, because there's so much information in it, good stuff. This is the end paper of the book, and it shows you the life of the manufacturing of a simple garment, something that we don't even think about. We just buy this thing, a zippered garment. But I also want to point out all the different components that go into this. Well, first of all, there are two things I want to point out. One is the number of hands involved in making a garment like this. It's a complicated garment. I think it has something like 40 steps. Okay, so you need a line of people, each person doing a different step. And that's after the whole thing has been cut. That's the photo, that's the drawing at the top next to the building. So first you have to cut the thing, then you have to sew it all together, and then there are all these other components, right? There's, as Chris mentioned before, there's the zipper. They were able to find one American zipper company, independent American zipper company in the United States, based in LA. Who knew? They were able to find a company that makes the drawstring here in the United States, one company. They were able to find a company in Connecticut that makes the grommets that you put into. So I just want you to think about, like, this is really involved. This is a difficult thing to do now. When you no longer have industry, all these other ancillary industries disappear too. Oops. Now this is one of Chris's photographs, and I'm trying to hurry a little bit so that you don't stand here too long, but very quickly, this could have been the, well, go ahead.
Yeah, I spoke about images, certain shots that really, to me, personified my project and brought it into focus. And you brought something really into focus the other day, because we were trying to figure out where to put my images and hers and how to tell the story and make it, cohesive. I've always loved this image because this was a space that was completely intact, like literally thousands of these, what they call them maypole braiders. They make shoelaces and drawstrings. And I found it in Rhode Island, and I had seen it, this picture or something like it, in a book from the 70s about New England textile mills. And I saw it and I said, oh man, there it is again. That's what I missed. They were still in business. I called them up and I said, are you guys, do you still have these? And he says, yeah, we've got like 2,500 of them. I was there like the next day. But I love this shot, but it's also lacking, it has all the equipment, but it's lacking something that you kind of honed in on. And something that I realized I was also searching in this project that I never really found. And that is the sense of community. It's the same thing I was seeking in those state hospitals, where there was a sense of community of all these people living and working together in this sort of self-sustaining community. And that's what this mill didn't have anymore. They were still using it, but they weren't using it like they were, and they didn't have that community working there. And so you brought that up, and I think what's wonderful is that we're now going to see a mill that does have life in it.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so when you make clothes, you need a lot of hands. And this is American Roots. This is some of the people who work there. This is their factory. It's actually in an old mill building up in Maine that used to make the warp for weaving, the warp yarn. So here they are. Here are the workers. You need a lot of hands, a lot of people. So Ben and Whitney start creating this factory. They hire workers, they train workers. You just saw some of them. And then suddenly 2020 hits. And this is where I enter their lives. So what happens when you're staring down the barrel of the gun, you make things, and you know that these orders are all going to dry up? They didn't have private equity backing them. There was no rich person or rich entity supporting them. They had mortgaged their house and cashed in their retirement to start this factory. And so I would say on March 18th, whenever it was, they shut down their factory. Ben and Whitney are sitting on their couch and they know that they're doomed. They're about to lose everything. And then they see the images coming out of New York City. And they realize, and it's very evident, that first responders and hospital workers are not going to have the protective gear that they need. And Whitney turns to Ben and she says, we make things, we can make protective gear. So they pivot to manufacturing masks, they create their own mask, and they end up actually creating about almost 1 million masks that year, and they quintuple in size to make PPE. Now, why was it possible? In great part because suddenly the Chinese, who were making most of our PPE, were no longer sharing their PPE with us because they needed it for themselves. And so there was suddenly a demand for American goods. Like, this is a perfect model to see how that plays out. So suddenly these guys are in business and they need more workers than they can even find. And they are on their way to really building this incredible community of sewers and workers.
And so as this was happening, received a call. I wasn't doing much photography that year, but I did get a call from the New York Times Magazine, and they said, we want you to go up to this hospital in Springfield, this Bay State Health. It's like a conglomeration of hospitals. And I said, we want you to go to this warehouse. And this hospital system is having a really hard time finding PPE. And we want you to photograph the workers and the way they're trying to stockpile and solicit vendors to make these things that we literally can't make here anymore. And they didn't run, I don't think this photo ever ran, but in their warehouse, they had all the prototypes that were sent in from various vendors. And I'll tell you, some of them look legitimate, but most of them look like someone had bought a garbage bag and, cut holes in it. And it was just really sad because I realized, if we actually made clothing, all those clothing manufacturers could pivot and solve that need. But here they were, scrambling. I mean, it's an amazing story how they were just, these hospitals were competing to try to find vendors to make what they needed. So, but I guess in the case of your company, American Roots, it worked out all right. But at that time, it was, everyone was in dire shape.
All right, we're going to race through. This is still you.
I guess, yeah. So I think we've tried to present a positive picture tonight. And as much as I'd like to show abandoned textile mills with their really cool machinery, I'll just touch briefly on some of the things that that have happened to a lot of these great mills, and that they get bought up by private equity, and the private equity company doesn't see the value of the brand, of the fact that not only do you have a famous brand that makes kind of iconic plaid and flannel, but part of the value of that brand is that it's made as Woolwich was, made in Woolwich, PA. And the tragedy is that they don't invest in these, they don't reinvest money in the factories. And so when you go to the factories, of course they're going to want to shut them down because no one's taking care of them. So that's just one of the bad things that happened, and the very sad things that happened. But I have seen a lot of good things along the way. And I'm happy to say that, these smaller companies have been able to reinvent themselves. And sometimes they do this by, military contracts with the government, by doing camouflage. Sometimes they do, when you think of textiles, most of us think of apparel, but textiles are everywhere. And so the companies that have succeeded, they didn't make clothing, they make other things like outdoor environmental fabric, or fabric for curtains or couches, upholstery. So I was fortunate to see a lot of good things, and this is in rural Maine, and this company is doing great. So there are bright spots. Just when you think that there isn't anything else out there, you find these real gems. Some companies have sort of stayed the same, or used traditional methods to cater to high-end niche markets in interior design. This is a carpet for a state House of Representatives. So using traditional methods to create really high-quality products for a clientele that's going to pay for it. This is in Jessup, PA. MTL, they make fabric for high-end interior designers, and also like for Knoll furniture. So there's some ways to succeed by doing exactly what you've been doing all along. There are other applications too, like high-performance sportswear, and you got to realize that making fabric, like making the material for my shirt or whatever, that's automated, and that can be done anywhere. And that's why you do see a lot of that still down south. And you see it even in New England, because that can go anywhere after that. It's the sewing, it's the apparel, the hands-on stuff that is very expensive. The woman on the right is actually making yarn that will be used, carbon fiber that will be used to make the blades for jet engines. So it's a very traditional method and a very traditional mill making high-tech stuff. Here's another mill that makes screen printing in Rhode Island. Haven't changed anything in 75 years. And then some of you might know Martin Greenfield in Brooklyn. They make high-end suits. So it's all about finding your niche and finding a way to make it work. And down south, there are still some very huge modern mills that make yarn, like the fabric, more so with the yarn. The yarn can go all over the world. It's all automated. So you still see production on a scale that doesn't really exist here anymore in the north. When I was, fortunately, the New York Times Magazine has supported a lot of my personal interests. And so if I have a feature in that, it's usually, oftentimes it's my idea, and they pair me with things that are of natural interest, like this textile mill in Georgia that is making carpets. And so a lot of times you have these high-end technology breakthroughs that are fused into traditional products in a way that you're not even aware of. And at Interface in Georgia, they're taking carbon dioxide and putting it in the backing of the carpet in a way that you'd never see it or even know it. So it's the same looking product. A lot of the means, the setting up of the machinery, the way it's the deft handwork, it's all the same. It's just what goes into it is different and very cutting edge. And perhaps our favorite, along with American Roots, sort of an American success story, are socks. I'm wearing these socks right now, Darn Tough from Vermont. I'd say socks are the one niche in the apparel industry that has found its way back here, high-end, well-made socks, because they can retool the machines very quickly, they can make a myriad of designs and patterns, and the human hand never comes in contact with these socks. And so a company like Darn Tough is doing great, and it's also, also marketing, and it's how you present yourselves. And it's if you have a modern company making a modern thing and it's well branded, then I think there will be an audience for it. And we have a couple of more slides. Thank you all for coming. And I'm going to end with this slide here that means a lot to me. It's the screen printing of the American flag in Annan in Virginia. Annan is a historic flag maker. They put their flag, they made flags, I think, during the Civil War. Their flag went to Iwo Jima. That's the one you see in the photo. The flag went to the moon. When I was there, I was sort of unprepared for how moving it was to see the American flag being made in many different ways. And when they stitch it together, when it's sewn together, they never let the flag touch the floor. So it's sort of always hung. They also screen print it. And what struck me about this was that how identifiable, recognizable the American flag is in all its iterations, and that it's sort of a whole greater than the sum of its parts. And I'd like to think, and I know this is being a little bit naive and romantic, but factories are kind of like the same way, because everyone must work as a team, as sort of a democracy, to create a better whole. And so this image is very important to me. And I've always felt a good way to end my lecture on a positive note. And back to you, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, that's great. Here's mine. I mean, along those very same lines, since Ben and Whitney got together and started their factory, they had 3 children, as well as running this factory, which now produces, they're about to hit $20 million in revenue. Producing their goods. And I want to say that since they started, again, creating something out of nothing in 2015, they've lifted 75 families out of poverty through manufacturing. So thank you so much for coming. I don't know if we have time for Q&A, but thank you so much. It's an honor to be in this room and to be able to speak to you.
We absolutely have time for a Q&A because we want to find out more from, and thank you so much. What a really wonderful partnership you were. You were both so much in tune, and the huge amount of topics you covered in 60 minutes. It was absolutely fascinating. So we're going to take some questions, but perhaps can I start off by asking a question? And I'm going to name it you, Rachel. So how, after making the PPE equipment, how fast a pivot was it back to manufacturing clothes? How was that a bumpy road?
Yeah, that was a very difficult pivot, in part because they weren't sure that they were going to get demand. It took 2 years for America to get back together. You may not have felt it quite as acutely as manufacturers, but it was really about demand. And so between the time that they started to get orders again for what they produced and the time that they rolled off their last mask, they had to let go of most of their employees. So they were up to 150, and then they had to go down to about 50, and it was very painful for them to do that. But they knew that they would be bringing them back. And fortunately now, most of them have come back into the fold. But this is another problem with manufacturing, right? It's very dependent on demand, the other. So there's the push. Can we give people the resources they need to start factories? And then the pull, how much demand is there? How regular is it? And how well can you manage the downtimes? Because there are always going to be downtimes.
Right, so many challenges. Right, so I want to also remind our online audience that you could submit questions, and Meg will pass them on to me. For our in-person audience, do we have any questions? Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Could you discuss how our getting out of NAFTA helped or hurt us? Was this a positive development, getting out of NAFTA? Was NAFTA destroying our industry, or what's your opinion of the rewriting of the NAFTA rules?
So the new version of NAFTA, which
Yes.
is called the USMCA, I think?
Well, it was originally, Mexico, Canada, and US, and it was.
So I think it's the USMCA. I think that's what it's
Yes.
called now. So the big issue was there weren't labor agreements built into the original one, and there weren't environmental agreements built into the original one. So the idea was, unfortunately, that there was no level playing field even on those terms, right? So there were more labor protections built into the new version. Unfortunately, we're finding that they can't really be enforced. And so you still don't have a level playing field. So you still have workers, for example, in Mexico, being used in a way that Americans would not find acceptable. Does that answer your question like that? So there's not, so as far as I understand, there is not a substantial change in the new agreement, the U.S.
But NAFTA, you feel, hurt the U.S., and there was a change needed. Apparently, it wasn't completely helpful to U.S. industry in the end result.
NAFTA was devastating to American manufacturing. I hope I'm clear
Yes,
about that.
yeah, okay.
Absolutely devastating. And I hear story after story after story about manufacturing factories that were profitable, but still were shipped abroad because they were not profitable enough. That's what we keep hearing, not profitable enough. It is a race to the bottom once you start lowering all these expectations about who's doing your manufacturing, right? If there are no rules, you will just go to the lowest common denominator. And it's something that I write about in my book quite a bit, about this idea of free-floating capitalism. Because when capital is able to move wherever it wants to go, it pits country against country, factory against factory, always looking for the cheaper place. We had hoped, actually, with NAFTA, or that we were sold the idea that actually, if we engaged all of these countries in a global trade, then countries would become more democratic and more open. And what we're finding is that that's not at all the case, because in fact, capital much prefers authoritarian regimes. People are more frightened, more easier to control. They're not going to complain about labor and environmental violations. And so actually, I have a brother who lives in Vietnam who just told me the other day, a lot of our stuff now is coming from Vietnam, that they are now jailing people who are like environmental activists. Like, that's the world that we have created in part by not prioritizing these issues. And of course, we know that we're going to have larger problems down the line environmentally. Forget about the exploitation of people, but just environmentally. I mean, this is just a building disaster as far as I'm concerned. Did you want to add?
I was just going to say, we didn't talk about this, but you and I did. But the one thing that I'm kind of on the, like I said, the visual side of things, but the one thing that I heard over and over again from people is, we could talk all day about wanting to bring stuff back here. But the real problem lies is that there's not a workforce that can do the work anymore. We've not only exported all the machinery and the goods, but we've exported the knowledge. And young people don't feel like they can work in a factory, or there's no place to learn it. And so I think I wrote in my book that the greatest, what I fear to be the greatest impediment to a resurgence, to a rebalancing, is this threat from within, in that there are no, it's like you go to the factory and they actually have tons of work that they need to do, but they can't get anyone, they can't hire anyone to do it. So, yeah.
Yeah, Rachel and Chris, it's such brilliant commentary, and you're so really well informed, and it's so refreshing to hear both of you speak. And it's really just more of a comment with what you're saying. I know it was sold as a globalization effort, and that it would lift up populations, and everyone would buy a blender, and it would be, but you're right about it's been given to governments that have used it, really weaponized it against their people, and it's something that needs to be carefully looked at. And even we hear about environmentalists here and decrying, the environment, and they don't talk about China, and they don't talk about India, and they don't talk about the pollution, that we could never counter all of that until that's paid attention to. And I think I'll summarize that it has become to a degree of there's an issue of national security, and we saw that with medications. And again, it's not that these aren't the best arguments I've heard, it's they're not being listened to, because again, when you want to oversimplify something, you don't take in the information that counters your thoughts. But I think the health of this nation really would depend, it's an element that could be very useful. And as far as young people, I think college education and the cost of it and the return on your investment is actually making people look at other options, because college has enjoyed a great ride, has become a luxury item. People have gone into great debt to pay for it, and I'm not so sure where you end up after it all. So you really just one of my favorite lectures for all of the things that you said, and you're on. Thank you for fighting for something wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. I just wanted to mention also the whole college thing. There are a lot of people who actually would do great working in physical work, right? Being mechanic. I mean, this is what you're dedicated to, is, I mean, being able to, I don't want to glorify manufacturing, but a lot of people find, being able to work in a physical environment, producing things or fixing things, to be extremely rewarding.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There was a lady over there, and then I'll take a couple of other, I'll take you, sir, and you, sir. But as I walk over to the lady over here, I am going to pose a question from our online audience. This is from Stephen, and this is really for you, Chris. What happened at the silk factory in Western Maryland when the workers went home on Friday, expecting to return on Monday? Could you tell us a little bit more about why that ended so suddenly? In 1957, was that when it was?
1957. I forget exactly why. You can look it up. It's a well-documented mill, but it's probably one of those things where the owners just decided to shut it down for economic reasons. It was passed down. The man I met had owned it for a long time, and he operated tours on kind of a need to give me a call and pay me $10 and I'll let you in. But it was amazing. The calendar was still there from September 1957. The shoes that people had left that they would put back on again on Monday. There were bags of silk skeins in the basement from Japan. It was amazing. But things like that are so rare now. And I admit I haven't kept up with a lot of these mills. Preparing for this lecture was the first time I actually went back and looked at the websites for the mills that I photographed, because for what I photograph old things, and most of the time these things are destroyed or torn down, and so a lot of the places I photographed no longer exist. Not so much because of foreign competition, but I think because the owners, the older people, just they get tired of doing this over and over, and they can't find a family member that wants to take it over. It doesn't interest young kids. I mean, the factories that I saw in all my travels around the country that were really exciting were the ones doing high-tech work, the chip fabs, aerospace, that were making products that look towards the future and where people can learn on the job, learn very valuable technical skills, and advance. And these older textile mills get a bad rap because people think it's like your grandfather's factory. But so I don't really know what's the state of it is now, and that's my fault, but it's heartbreaking to learn that usually the story doesn't end well.
This is a combination comment and question. I've been reading up on critical theory, which seems to be dominating the discourse in universities today, and it kind of basically vilifies capitalism and wants to show the world in terms of power, how the oppressors are in power and subjugating the oppressed, and if only we can find liberation in a Marxist ideology. And so when you say that, capitalism is, there's like an authoritarianism in these capitalist countries, and then you talk about manufacturing in Vietnam, which is a Marxist country, and more manufacturing in China, which is also a communist country. I mean, how can you say that? The most capitalist countries that have a free market economy are actually happier countries that people want to emigrate to because they want that freedom. Things aren't perfect, but to have the freedom to, create a business or live as you want is, I think, where the world should go. So anyway, that's my comment/question.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, yes, they are communist countries or Marxist countries, but they certainly embraced capitalism. So I don't know where that leaves them. But I hope you understand that I am pro-capitalism. I mean, this is a capitalist story. We have a couple that created a factory and they sell goods in the market and they employ people and they train people. So the question for me, kind of the overriding question is, how do we balance now these very competing, well, currently competing, but maybe shouldn't be, competing issues of environment, and taking care of the people who live in our society and create things for us or do things for us. How do we balance that with so many of the other issues that we are facing at this moment? And I looked at the questions through manufacturing, but of course we could look at the question any number of ways. But certainly the loss of manufacturing in the United States triggered a very new moment for us politically and culturally. I will say that, and we know that. The last 30 years have been transformative, and sometimes in not very positive ways. So I'm making a link, it could be spurious, but you cannot argue that 5 million jobs have gone abroad, countless numbers of factories, many of them very small, because the bulk of manufacturing in the United States was actually quite on a rather small scale, gone. What Chris has been documenting are mostly family-owned factories that supported families for generations, gone. And then we see this complete change, in the political and cultural landscape in the United States, I think.
Right, just because time is getting on, I'm going to take the last two questions. Oh, okay, okay, but could we just, I'm going to ask you to make your eloquent fascinating answers. We'll just keep them a little shorter, and perhaps you could, thank you, just so then, and of course, we have books to sell and to sign.
I'll try to be quick as well. There's a story I read in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm sure it was more than 20 years ago. It concerned a washing machine factory that I'm pretty sure was in Iowa, a Maytag factory, I think.
Okay.
So, and the icing on the cake in this story was they took the whole factory to Mexico
Yeah.
and then sent key people down there to train them how to use it.
Right.
I just thought that was beautiful.
Yeah. That actually, if you want to get a book about that, it's called American Made. Sorry, I know all these titles sound the same, by Farrah Stockman, which came out in 2021, I think. And it details, it's a specific case study of a factory where all the stuff was sent over to Mexico, and you see what, you follow the characters and see what happened to the people when that was happening.
I will add also that I spent Maytag, Whirlpool owns Maytag, and I think Whirlpool's gotten some bad raps over the years, but I spent a fair amount of time in Ohio going to several Whirlpool factories, and they were very proud of the fact that they've kept a lot of their appliance manufacturing in the States. And I'll tell you, to go to these factories was like the washing machine factory in Clyde, Ohio was just like, it was overwhelmingly huge. They were cranking these things out, and there was a sense of pride that in the workers and also in the company. And so I think appliances are actually kind of one of the few things that a lot of that has managed to stay over here. GE still has Appliance City, I think it's called, in Kentucky. Speed Queen still makes appliances in Wisconsin. I mean, there's a lot of it. Chances are, you know, if your appliance is a Whirlpool or GE, it was made in this country.
Or Mexico.
I was going to ask you originally a point about the fact that I've worked in a lot of electromechanical things and done purchasing decisions and so on. And I run into a common thing with machines or objects like let's say that thing over there with a sound system or whatever, where it will say made in America. When you open it up, it has parts from a jillion places all over. And I realize a lot of it, the manufacturing has to do with environmental issues too, and things like that. Like chips are designed in the country, in country here, but they're made in some other place where they
Korea.
don't have the standards.
South Korea, yeah.
But then when he said the thing about the Whirlpool thing, I've been following a trend in the whole issue of manufacturing and AI, which deals with the fact that they're going into factories and they're having people who are doing the various manufacturing steps teach the steps to an AI bot that's a humanoid shape thing, so it can fit into the place. And then when it succeeds at learning it, they are paid off and they leave, and that finishes the factory in terms of the education of the thing.
Right.
So
Yeah,
whichever,
if I could just real quick just say, like, we should be building those robots and we're not.
well, yeah, but then who has a job left?
Building robots is a job.
Yeah, there's some really exciting robots.
So we need to build robots, we need to service robots, we need to program robots. So in manufacturing, I think there are opportunities as well for that sector.
Absolutely. That's something that I've been photographing a little bit. There are some exciting companies here in the States making robots. They haven't let me in yet because it's very proprietary, but I've seen these things firsthand. And yes, it is scary that AI is sort of coming for these jobs, but you know, robots have been been used in manufacturing for years. And a lot of these jobs that they would be doing, people are not necessarily want to do them anyway. No, it's not. Look, it is scary, but the future's scary. So.
There was one thing when it was like back in the 18 whatever with the milling machines, where with the Industrial Revolution, where somebody could say, I could do this in my house, making the cloth. Nowadays, the thing that is there is the machines are beyond the level of most people to repair or program, and they're programming themselves and so on. So it's producing a group of people who are, it's just like a doctor. It takes years to be a doctor, to be able to do the work involved in this kind of level of technology is not something that you can just casually learn like repairing a car. In fact, repairing a modern car nowadays takes years of skill now. It isn't something you can just pick up in your driveway anymore. So it's just kind of that sort of problem.
Well, certainly, we should own it. We should, it's part of manufacturing. So let's make sure that we own it. We do it here. We build the robots. We figure it out. We integrate them in as much as possible into the manufacturing economy. But I do think, there's all kinds of making. Some of it does not lend itself because it's too cheap, like the product is too cheap, does not lend itself to manufacturing by robots right now. And maybe in the future, I can't talk about the future too far in the future.
That's the next book.
I only live right here in 2024, but I hear you. Like my job might be taken over by AI at some point. So yes, I hear you. I hear you.
I realize, and I'm sorry, I know there are some people here who still, I wanted to ask questions both in person and online, and I'm so sorry we didn't get to them, but I think this is like an ongoing discussion. But in the meantime, I do want to, for our in-person audience in particular, I just want to mention that these two wonderful books are available this evening for you to purchase, and they will be signed by our wonderful speakers. I just want to thank you both so much again. Your eloquence, your intelligence, your grasp of such complex subjects that you presented so clearly and concisely. We are so grateful for you for being part of our lecture series. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And finally, just to say a few words, is our Executive Director, Victoria Dangle, and then I hope the in-person audience will join us for a glass of wine.
Thank you. And I'll be brief because I made some comments there. Wow, what a brilliant presentation. And here's to a resurgence. It would be brilliant in American manufacturing. I love your persistence, your will. Rachel, you're single-minded. It's not about the obstacles, or it's about it's a path, and it's an important path. And here's to more people hearing these important voices. And I just have to say, come on, this is the stuff movies are made out of. Like the way your paths were crossing all of these years, and this was the first meeting. I think what a New York story. I know you're from other places, but wait, you're originally from Boston. Oh, both. Wow. Okay, but I'm taking it as a New York story. All right. So thank you. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you. Thank you.